This is InvestorShare's Blockchain for Dummies, Part 2. What is a blockchain? To tell you what a blockchain is, I'm going to tell you another story. This story has three things: the neighborhood, which we'll call the network, the builders, otherwise known as miners, and a library, which later we'll call a block. So, the story begins. There's a beautiful neighborhood. Lots of people live in this neighborhood and they like it. And they decide they'd like to have a library. There's a big empty lot of land over there, a big block. So they call a bunch of builders, miners, and they say, "Hey builders, miners, would you mind building us a library over there on that block?" And the miners say, "Sure." So the builders get to building, and members of the team start to wheel in books before the library's finished. But this library isn't going to stock educational books and non-fiction and fantasy. No, this library only stores one book. The book is called Transaction History, the entire transaction history of the neighborhood. So, the builders are building and wheeling in books. So, if the only book that is stored in the library is transaction history, then that means that we're going to call it a transaction library. You can go in that library anytime and see the whole history of transactions on the neighborhood, the network. So, the problem was that everyone in the neighborhood, the network, thought that transaction library was just a little bit clunky. It's kind of tough to just say transaction library every single time you want to talk about it, so they decided to call it a block, because it's on that block of land over there. So now, when you hear transaction library, block. When you hear block, it means transaction library. Got it? Let's go to the next part. Transaction library equals block. However, why would these builders go and make these blocks? Well, it turns out that the neighborhood, the network, was so appreciative for all of the work that the builders, the miners, were doing that they said, "Here, we'd like to pay you in Bitcoin." Bitcoin is the native currency of the neighborhood, the network. So the builders said, "Thank you so much. We appreciate that Bitcoin is valuable, just like gold." Everyone agrees that Bitcoin is valuable. So now the builders, the miners, turn around and say, "Would you like another transaction library? I mean a block." And the neighborhood says, "We would love another transaction library. I mean a block." So the builders get to building, mining, because they're miners. So the miners start mining the next block, right next door to the original one. And when they're done, they connect the two libraries, blocks, and they create what's called the library network, right? The entire transaction history of the neighborhood, the network, is stored in the library network. So they keep doing this. Then they start to build what's called the block network. Remember, the block is where the transaction history is stored. So now they're creating the block network. The block network looks like this. After a little while, the builders have built so many blocks that it starts to look like this. And now it looks like a chain. So instead of calling it all these other things, the network says, "Look, let's just call it the blockchain." So that's what the blockchain is. When you hear the word blockchain, it is the transaction history of the neighborhood, the network. So if you lived in the neighborhood, that's where the transaction history would be stored. If you operated on the network, the blockchain network, the blocks are where the transaction history would be stored. So, the neighborhood is wrapped around the entire Earth. Remember the network we were talking about before? Imagine that the neighborhood is that 1 billion computers wrapped around the entire Earth. That's the blockchain. The blockchain is Earth's global public ledger of transactions. That's the blockchain. So, The blockchain is stored on the ledger on those 1 billion computers. What that means is that it is immutable. If I lose a copy or my computer shuts down, there's a copy on your computer. If my whole country shuts down, there's copies in other countries. It's everywhere. This makes it immutable. It can't be changed, it can't be deleted, and it can't be hacked. We can get more into detail about that inside the Investor Share courses as to why the cryptography that creates these blocks is so immutable. But rest assured, they're very secure. They're very safe. That's the blockchain. So, move to the next course to see how all this information could be used to make you money.